You are listening to Productivity Straight Talk with your host, Amber De La Garza. Amber is a sought-after productivity coach, trainer, speaker, and writer who gives entrepreneurs the straight talk on personal productivity. No BS, fluff, or overused jargon. Just actionable strategies to get results and succeed in business. And here is your host, Amber De La Garza, the Productivity Specialist.
Welcome, and thank you for listening to Productivity Straight Talk. Today is episode 263. ADHD and Business Ownership, an entrepreneurial case study with Diann Wingert. If you're a business owner who wants to learn effective business strategies, improve your time management, and elevate your productivity to maximize profits, reduce stress, and make time for what matters most, then you're in the right place, and I'm so glad you've joined me. Today, I sit down with business strategist, coach, and mentor Diann Wingert for an in-depth conversation about the intersection of ADHD and business ownership, and specifically how she manages it daily. Diann became a business strategist, coach, and mentor after a 20-year career as a psychotherapist. Her mission is to help female solopreneurs with big ideas and busy brains get focused, fired up, and flame retardant. Diann is the creator of the Boss Up Breakthrough and host of the Driven Woman Entrepreneurial podcast, a Peloton enthusiast, profane Buddhist, and has been called the speaker of uncomfortable truths. In today's episode, we will cover things such as how does ADHD show up in your business, why unmanaged ADHD can prevent your success, ways Diann has successfully managed her traits, and I bet you're going to learn some good tips, what time blindness and time optimism are, why ADHD is not not a superpower, as it's often said, and so much more. And now, let's meet our guest and get to the straight talk. Welcome to Productivity Straight Talk, Diann. How are you?
I have been so looking forward to this call, Amber. Last time we saw each other in person was like 3 years ago.
Yes. And so, I don't actually get all the pitches and people that are saying, hey, I want to be a guest. They go through my content manager and she got yours and she's like, this is personal. Like she knows you. Like this is a great conversation. You need to check this one out like right away. And so you did a really great job of sharing and reminding me of our conversation we had. We met at a podcasting conference and you had not yet started your podcast, but we're in the works to it. And now you are 100+ episodes into podcasting and you circled back about being a guest. And I'm so glad you did. Seriously, the conversation we're getting ready to have, I think is going to be phenomenal for so many.
Let's do it.
All right, awesome. So let's start with sharing a little bit about yourself outside of your official bio. What are some things that we may want to know about maybe your entrepreneurial journey, or how did you get here to become a podcaster and have your own business?
Oh, good. That's juicy. I would say, Amber, I always knew I was entrepreneurial, but I didn't know what it was called. Even when I was a little kid, I look back now and I'm like, oh goodness, this is so obvious. I didn't start my first business until much later in life, but I was that kid in the second grade who sold more Girl Scout cookies than the rest of my troop combined.
Wow.
I was that kid who almost got kicked out of my after school daycare because I set up a little business and I had other kids in the daycare working for me.
This is so good. I have a niece and she is in the second grade and I am certain, I tell her parents all the time, I'm like, she's going to be an entrepreneur. She has these little side hustles at school and the same thing, just really, really creative thinking.
Well, what's really funny about it, Amber, is that I didn't really know any entrepreneurs. I didn't really know that my way of looking at things was different, but I'll give you a perfect example that later on I realized, oh, this is exactly right. Shortly after I graduated from college, I was looking for a job just temporarily while I figured out, am I going to move to the East Coast to pursue my interests and so forth? And in the meantime, I got a job at a gym, right? And about 10 days into the job, I asked if I could speak to the manager, or actually the owner, because I heard he was on the premises. And he asked me, is everything okay? Are you happy with the job? What do you need? And I said, oh, everything's great. I just made some observations from my first 10 days here. And I wondered, since you're not here very often, I wondered if I could share them with you. And I had like 7 pages of notes on a legal pad. And we started going through them in his office. He says, would you wait here for just a minute? And literally 5 minutes later, I see the manager walking down the sidewalk in front of the building with a box. Like he literally fired the guy on the spot, promoted me. And it's because I literally treated the business as though it were my own, even though I only intended to be there a short time. And it's something that I've realized that, if you act like it's your business when it isn't, you should have a business. And years later, I finally did.
And I bet that's serving you so well right now, for sure.
Yep.
Well, today we wanted to dive in because I have been really had this deep desire to have a conversation about ADHD and specifically the intersection of ADHD and being a business owner. And you shared with me that you have ADHD. And so we're going to have a conversation today to explore what that's like, what it's like for many others. And so let's just jump off from there. How old were you when you realized you had ADHD?
This is a good one. And actually, it's a little cringeworthy, but I've told the story before, so I promise not to cringe. I had already completed my first career when I was in my 30s, and I decided to return to school at UCLA and get a master's in social work and go into the field to become a social worker and a therapist. And because my oldest child, I have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who I have lovingly passed on my ADHD to all 3 of them. 2 of them have been officially diagnosed. I did my master's thesis on whether ADHD persists into adulthood. Now, this is really interesting because this was the early 90s. And at that time, Amber, only little boys were being diagnosed, not little girls, and no adults. And the current thinking, I trained at UCLA, which was considered a pretty pristine and high-profile training institute. All of my professors, all of my preceptors, all of my supervisors said, well, we know that this is something that happens to a small percentage of boys and they outgrow it by adolescence. So I started interviewing a lot of the dads of these kids just because of my own curiosity. I kind of wanted to know how my son was going to turn out because he was 8 and he had been recently diagnosed. And the more of these fathers I met, the more I thought, wait a minute, they don't outgrow this, at least not by this group of people.
Yeah.
And so I actually did my thesis on whether ADHD persists into adulthood. And there's a little section in the thesis where you are supposed to disclose any biases you have as a researcher. So I said, my son has been diagnosed with ADHD. And the more I learn about it, the more I realize that I identify with many of these traits myself. Ended the topic, got the thesis done, finished grad school, went out in the working world, and promptly forgot that ADHD had anything to do with me.
Oh my gosh. Okay, hold on. Before you transition.
That's the cringy part.
Yeah, well, hold on. Before I go, I'm like so like into this story, but I've got shivers because my brother in the 90s was diagnosed with ADHD and was also told that he would grow out of it.
Yes.
And at that time, of course, it's based on the sister's memory. But at that time, it was like, oh, just like kind of just like a label and just deal with it because it'll go away anyways. Yeah. And it was almost like a label to justify some behavior that, either my mom saw or and he was experiencing. But it wasn't what I see it as today, which is like once you identify there's resources and help and understanding. So I just want to say, oh my gosh, like I had no idea you're right. Of course, I didn't know you were writing this thesis and that specifically was what it was about, because that was my brother's experience.
Yes. And I think this is really damaging in so many ways, because whenever we tell somebody that something is temporary, they really don't take it that seriously. They rarely are motivated to learn anything about it. And it often becomes kind of I want to say an excuse, but sort of like, well, he has ADHD and just be patient with him. He's going to outgrow it and everything's going to be fine. So you don't take it seriously. You don't pay enough attention to it, but it's confusing for the kid because he's told you have to take this medication. And back in those days, they didn't have the long acting version of Ritalin, Vyvanse, all the different drugs they do today. So those little boys had to go at lunchtime to the nurse's office and get their afternoon pill. And it was like doing the walk of shame from Game of Thrones, walking down the hallway, going to the nurse's office. And a lot of the boys would really, really fight their parents to get off the medication because other kids would tease and make fun of them. So fast forward many years later, my daughter, my youngest child, is identified, and I prefer identified rather than diagnosed because I feel it's less stigmatizing. She was identified with ADHD as an adult in college. I think she was 21 at the time. By that time, it was like, well, yes, some girls have it. Now, do you want to know the single fastest group of people being diagnosed with ADHD? The fastest growing group? Women over 40. Why? Because a lot of women over 40 have a kid who is at the age that they're probably being identified, usually through the school, because teachers like kids that can sit still, be quiet, not interrupt, and do what they're told. If you have ADHD, that's going to be a bit of a problem. So moms are like, well, wait a minute, and some doctors are savvy enough to say, so do any of these traits apply to you? I'm very playful, a little teasing, and I'll say, okay, so you have ADHD. Who's responsible for this? Mom, dad, or both?
Yeah.
But I did not officially get diagnosed until midlife myself, because you are ADHD for life. You learn ways to work with it. We'll talk about entrepreneurship in a second. But after you go through menopause at around age 50, the drop off in estrogen will actually make your ADHD symptoms worsen.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So that's when I said, okay, I'm gonna get some help. And it was really funny when I went to see a child psychiatrist to get diagnosed, because they know more about ADHD than anyone. And a lot of adult psychiatrists or adult physicians, when someone says, look, I figured out I really do have ADHD, I've been questioning it for years, or I always knew something was different about me. And then my friend said, this is you. A lot of adult psychiatrists and internists and general practitioners will turn you away because they do not understand the current thinking, which is this is a lifelong condition. You do not outgrow it. Not everybody needs medication, but the sooner you figure out this is you, the sooner you can start managing it more effectively.
Yes. In my experience, I have had clients and I've had friends and family members. It's almost like this little nagging voice that comes and goes throughout your adult life. And there's situations where you're asking yourself, maybe I do have ADHD. Nah, never mind. And it really takes, sitting down and looking at what are the behavior symptoms. And I think that it's true, right? That symptoms show up differently for different people and different genders. And so that can also be confusing to someone that's wondering, do I have that? In the work that I do, productivity, time management, it does often come up about what is your attention span and how often can you focus? In what situations do you work best? And there are a lot of people that say, I think now that I'm focusing on this part of my work, I think I might have ADHD. So again, this comes up. And so I love that you shared that you felt most comfortable going to a child psychologist because you felt like they psychiatrist. I'm sorry. Psychiatrist. No, yes. Thank you for correcting me. Because you felt like they were the ones that would understand most. What was that experience like? Were you nervous? Were you, I mean, what did that feel like thinking, okay, I'm calling to see if I have ADHD?
It was an interesting experience because I think the way you described it, Amber, is really quite accurate. I would say I danced with the diagnosis for years.
That's beautifully said.
When I was in, thank you. When I was in grad school and I thought, well, my son is, we still didn't know this was genetic, which it is. But I thought, well, this seems to apply to me. What I will say is that I always knew I was different. I always knew that I solved problems differently. Mm-hmm. I always knew that I always needed to be busy. And if something was interesting to me, I could do it indefinitely and lose track of time. But if it wasn't interesting to me, it was painful to get me to do it, even if there were serious consequences. So I knew that I was different. And usually in our culture, Western culture, growing up public school, different is not a good thing. Different is never a good thing. You might be different, superior, but different is not good because we teach kids to conform. You have a kid, so you know.
I know, yes.
We teach kids to conform because that is what a public school classroom requires for order. And so the teacher can be in charge and things can proceed according to his or her plan. So the highly creative, very energetic kid who has an interest-based brain, not an importance-based brain. Like if you tell a kid this is important, pay attention. A neurotypical kid, which is someone who does not have ADHD, a neurotypical kid will hear important and they'll do it. Mm. If it's not interesting to the kid with ADHD, it's not important to him or her. And so it starts to appear to parents, teachers, grandparents, soccer coaches, daycare workers, Sunday school teachers, that this kid is obstinate, this kid is oppositional, this kid is, a problem child, and they don't try to find different ways to connect. And I think this is, to me, one of the greatest losses to our culture, because in my experience of many, many years working with people with ADHD in all kinds of scenarios, family members, clients, colleagues, people I've hired, highly creative, innovative, out-of-the-box thinkers, risk takers, oftentimes extremely curious, so they don't give up. If something grabs their interest, they keep looking. They tend to be the most innovative people, the greatest visionaries. And I think these are the people that move society forward, always and only. But if they've been made to think, I'm broken, I'm damaged, I'm less than, there's something wrong with me, my brain doesn't work, it's no wonder that so many people with ADHD develop anxiety, depression, addictions, eating disorders, and very low self-esteem, because those messages just strike at the core. And one other thing I want to point out, a lot of people with ADHD, it's part of the emotional side of ADHD, is something called rejection sensitive dysphoria. A lot of people have been talking about this lately on social media. I don't like the term rejection sensitive dysphoria because I think it's overly pathologizing, but I will say people with ADHD tend to be more sensitive to rejection, perceived rejection. So if they think someone's giving them the side eye when they're talking to them, they may just shut down. They may prevent themselves from marketing, selling, being visible, getting out on video, sharing their voice, or even asking people for the business because they're so acutely tuned into the possibility of rejection that they just avoid the whole situation so that they don't have to feel it. And clearly, that is going to hold someone back when they're self-employed in a very big way.
Absolutely. When you got diagnosed, were you a business owner at that time?
I was. In fact, that's the other major reason. Thanks for bringing me back to the question. And by the way, can I just point out what I just did there?
Go ahead. Go for it.
People with ADHD have a tendency to go on tangents, and they often need to be reeled in by others. And because I refuse to shame myself anymore, when I realize, oh, the way you just said that, it's because I didn't fully answer the question you asked. I may have said something valuable. I may have said something interesting, but I didn't specifically and completely answer your question.
Mm-hmm.
I allowed myself to be reeled back, and I said, thank you for reminding me. I wasn't able to do that in the past because of my own rejection sensitivity. I would have felt like, oh shit, she asked me a question. I went off on a tangent as usual. And now she's like, could you just answer the frickin' question? So it is a skill. It is an awareness that you're not shaming me, you're not blaming me, but you're specifically interested in the answer to the question you asked. And I'm sure there are people listening who also are. So you're doing me a kindness to remember that. But I have to be willing to manage my own emotions so that I receive it that way and don't feel criticized or shamed. And that took work. Quite honestly.
I could imagine it took work, but seriously, you taking that minute to pull back, I think is going to be so impactful. And here's why. I wasn't thinking that at all, but I could put myself in your shoes and see that spiral thought of, oh, I did this again. Oh, I'm on a tangent. Oh, I was speaking. And then maybe discredit what you were saying when everything you said was valuable. So I can totally see your perspective. A lot of the work I do with my coaching clients is around the mindset work, the stories we tell ourselves, those loops. And you just explain those loops that you experience and how you've worked on them to rewrite them or not be as sensitive to them when they're happening. Okay, that was all absolutely brilliant. But yes, I did want the answer. So were you a business owner?
No. Yes, I was.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
See, sometimes this is what it takes. Now, you clearly work with a lot of people with ADHD, and I know that because anyone who works in productivity does, but also because you sent like 57 reminders for this interview. And the last one was 10 minutes ago. And by the way, people with ADHD, as you know, have a condition that most people refer to as time blindness. I prefer time optimism because I always think I have more time than I actually do. So the reminding is like, come back to me. Yes, I had already been a business owner for about 5 years. And that's another thing. I'm a little bit peeved by people calling ADHD the entrepreneur's superpower. I think ADHD can absolutely propel you to start a business, but your unmanaged ADHD may be the very thing that prevents you from being successful with that business, because what we don't know can hurt us. Yes, I was a business owner. I had always been very successful working for other people because of the structure, the support, the accountability, all the systems that literally helped me focus on what I was supposed to do and in the right order and on time. Once you start working for yourself, all of that goes bye-bye.
Yes.
You either have to hire someone to bring that to your attention. Most of the successful male entrepreneurs that I know have an executive assistant who manages them like a mother would a toddler. And it's very effective, but most women don't do that. So we might struggle more. And I know I did.
Well, and maybe the great tip of maybe that's not your superpower is to create that structure, but to have someone within your business that has that high level of accountability.
Yep.
So I do have clients that thrive. They are, like you said, the visionaries, the fast paced, the quick starts. They need someone behind them that's grounding them, that can handle the details of their schedule. And that lets them show up their best, but also ensures they're not creating all these fires in their business oftentimes.
Yes,
right?
Because we are usually the bottleneck. And there's a couple of things. One is that the time optimism means you're going to overcommit. You just are, because you do not have the time and energy and bandwidth that you think you do. And so that's something to embrace. Another thing is something I call the default yes. Like we do tend to be people pleasers. And whenever somebody pitches us on something, a new idea, new collaboration, hey, you want to look at this? Oh, hey, can I pick your brain? We default to yes. First of all, yes is easier than no because no always feels like you have to explain why it's a no.
Right.
But yes is like, that was easy, makes the other person happy. It's just easier and it always feels like the right answer. No always feels like I have to justify this. I have to rationalize this. I have to explain this, which is not true. But I think that's how we're conditioned, especially as females. So this impulsive decision making, this time optimism, and the default yes means you will completely overcomplicate your business and life unless you have somebody managing the back end who's like trimming your sails and blocking time on your calendar so that you don't. Like a typical thing, you're dealing with someone with ADHD when they schedule back to back to back to back to back meetings and they always show up like 2 minutes late because it's hard for us to end things on time. And the only reason we end them at all is because we've got someone else in another Zoom room waiting for us.
And so when you say that it's hard for us, you use the word us to say no, you want to say yes. Why do you think that is? Now, I know you said yes is easier, but is it because you don't see what the yes means, like the commitment, all the details behind it? You're like, again, it goes back to what you're calling time optimism, but like, is that even a filter when you're saying yes? Do you think about that in that moment or is it later?
No, this is why one of the key, I prefer instead of symptom, like I prefer instead of diagnosis, I prefer identify. And I prefer traits instead of symptoms because I'm trying to destigmatize the language that prevents people from getting whatever kind of help they are willing to get and need. But when we just don't see things through, because the way people with ADHD experience time, it's not like this is the immediate, then there's the short term, then the immediate term, and the longer term, and the really long term, like over a lifespan or even over a month. The way we experience time is it's either now, like right now, or it's not now. And everything in the not now is everything from like after this call to tonight, tomorrow, next month, the holidays, and the rest of my life. It's all sort of out there. So when you don't really see anything but the moment you're in, these are executive functioning deficits. The executive functions are planning, prioritizing, sequencing, anticipating future needs, allocating resources for future. I mean, you see how important this is in business. So that's why I say, the excitement of starting a business is great when you have ADHD. We are really good starters, but we can be kind of shitty finishers because once you get out of the starting blocks and the initial novelty and enthusiasm wears off, there's all these other stages and phases that are like in our blind spot. So that's why I'm absolutely certain a lot of people who are attracted to you have ADHD because we always need help to be productive so that we're not just trying to get more done. We're actually doing the right things at the right time in the right order for the right reason. That doesn't come naturally to us.
Okay. All right. So my burning question is, what are your best tips and strategies to work with your traits as an entrepreneur? So when you say something like, we lack executive function, and you gave a lot of great examples, how have you worked with that trait and in your business? Like, how does that show up for you?
One of the ways it shows up for me and that I teach with the coaching clients and the business strategy clients that I work with is that I accept without any shame that I have time optimism. I accept that the default yes is like hardwired into my DNA. I accept that there are 4 different things that will drive me. And if I'm not very intentionally choosing interest or challenge, I will default to novelty and urgency, which is why we say, I do my best work at the last minute. It is not your best work, friend. It's the work you got done when your time ran out. And something is better than nothing, so we call it our best work. We always do better work when we give ourselves more time. But like all behavior, doing things at the last minute is habit forming. So understanding shiny object syndrome and FOMO and rejection sensitivity are hardwired into our DNA. And I don't debate those things. I don't deny them. I don't defend them. I just accept this is how I'm wired. Because a lot of energy and emotion is wasted trying just denial or trying to, well, that's not it. It's this. It's like, no, this is how we are. And if you just accept that, then you can work with it strategically. My assistant has been empowered to tell me what to do instead of the other way around. It's like, I say, listen, I understand, like on paper, I'm the boss. But I need you, I call it bossing me around, but I need you to not let me run away with things. So like something shiny and new, I want it. I need it. I don't know how I ever lived without it. I got to have it. And I actually submit that these are the things that I wanted to add to the business this week. I wanted to jump on 3 new social media platforms. I wanted to buy 5 new pieces of software. I wanted to join 17 new memberships. And I give her a list. And then we have this little thing. She's just like, okay, which ones are in alignment with our current focus and goals? Now I'm already starting to, like the energy high is already starting to,
right.
And it's like, now, if I still felt shame about being who I am and how I am, this would not work.
Right.
But
I was just thinking that, like, if you had shame around this, you would actually avoid that meeting. Like, while you empowered her,
or I would go,
you'll just say, actually, never mind, and just not show up to the meeting.
Or even, I got to look for a new assistant. She's just inappropriate. No, I think the way I look at it is this. It starts with self-acceptance. And the fact that I was a therapist for a lot of time, it really does help me understand what people need to not do therapy, but to basically unpack the internalized shame of being different. I now believe what makes you different makes you special. So I practice and teach radical self-acceptance. Because all the messages you were given growing up, all the messages you gave yourself, why can't I get my shit together? What the hell is wrong with me? I can't believe I did this again. The feedback you get from other people, the one that always just really, and still I kind of flinch a little bit is, well, as we discussed, Diann, because another part of ADHD is having a really shit memory. And so as we discussed, Diann, in that tone is reminding me that I forgot something important. And that used to make me very defensive and argumentative, or I would just be like, you're dead to me. Like, I'm just not dealing with this person anymore. Now I'm like, yes, I know we discussed it and I need you to go through it with me again. Or here's another asking for tips and tricks. If somebody, like I get pitches, you have a podcast for a minute, you start getting pitches, right? And my inclination is to say yes, because that's how I'm wired. So I have trained myself to say, that sounds like an interesting proposition. Let me take a look at what we already have on the schedule and whether this would fit. If you don't hear back from me by, please circle back and remind me of this conversation. Because first of all, if they're pitching me, it's their responsibility to chase me, not the other way around. And I know I'm probably going to forget. And so in that technique right there, I'm hitting the pause button. So I'm not acting on the default yes. I'm giving myself some time and space to actually consider whether it would actually be a yes that I would intentionally commit to instead of just impulsively. And then I'm leaving it up to them to remind me of the conversation, because I may forget. And I think when they're pitching me, it is their responsibility to follow up with me. I may not remember, But then I usually have to kind of stick a pin in it because I don't want them to circle back and I've completely forgot about it in the meantime, because then I'm back in that, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. I got to come up with I need to tell them something. I'll just tell them yes, because, that'll make them happy. It's easier. Yeah.
So what I loved about that I just want to highlight for the listeners is that you saw an area in which you felt like maybe you had a misstep. Like you're always saying yes to people pitching you, right? And so what I heard was you put a script, you put a tool in your pocket, and you rewrote that default yes to here's my default script. And you thought it all out about here's how I'll follow up with myself. Here's how I'm going to ask them to follow up. And that is no longer an issue because you took a few minutes to think out that script. And now that's your tool. And
that is my tool.
I'm just thinking of how there's so many different ways in your business that if you thought out a different script that was your go-to, that wasn't a knee-jerk, like you say, yes, or quick start, that would be really, really helpful. So I love the script.
Hitting the pause button. I teach my clients, we generally don't make the best decisions under pressure. What feels like pressure to us is someone else's expectations. And then if you feel obligated, and this is not just for people with ADHD, by the way, like someone invites you to participate in their summit. Someone wants you to speak on their stage. Someone wants you to contribute to their cause, like whatever it is. I never say yes to anything on the spot anymore because I know that I would say yes to things and later go, oh man, I don't want to do that. And then sometimes you would make up a story about why you can't do it when in fact, no, you just impulsively said yes and you didn't give yourself a chance to think. So now, even if I know it's going to be an abso-frickin-lutely yes, no matter what, I still won't say yes. Why? Decision fatigue. Because I want it to be a habit. Every single time someone asks me for something, to do something, to join them in something, unless it's family or friends, I say, I need to see if it fit. I might say, I have to talk to my assistant. I have to look at my calendar. I'm not in front of my calendar. Like there's a few different ways to say it, but I have to hit the pause button every single time because if I do it intermittently, I feel the stress again. I get that shot of adrenaline and cortisol, and I'm more likely to commit to something that I really shouldn't. If it's the pause button every single time, I've created a neural pathway in my brain that gets me off the hot seat every time.
Yes. And also what I heard was you have a system for it, right?
Yes.
So then now where does it go? Does it go on your to-do list to think about it? Do you send it to your assistant and it shows up as an agenda being asked, like, is this an alignment? There's a system I'm picking up on that's happening behind the scenes with this. Can you share? Okay. Yeah. Share a little bit about that. What's your system?
So Voxer is a walkie-talkie app.
That's amazing. I will interject.
I certainly hope you have Pro, because here's another thing. Voxer is a terrific app for people with ADHD because not only can you leave messages for your clients, for other people in your network that are on Voxer, it's worth the Pro version because it has a superpower. You can recall the message, because if you tend to just blurt out the first thing that comes into your mind, hand raised, the second later, you're like, no, Diann, what the hell? So then I can click, recall, and they'll see that I recalled something. And then maybe they'll go, what was that? I'm like, oh, sorry, wrong person. And then I can think and then do it again. But I can leave messages for myself, which I do all the time. So I just, my phone is always on me. I pick it up and I say, follow-up item. Or I can send it to my assistant, or, and so I don't forget. It's a thought capture. And I'm an audio first person. I'm a verbal processor and I process things best through audio. So that's the easiest thing for me. Other people like text themselves a message. It's very adaptable to whatever your learning style is.
Absolutely. I use Voxer. We use it in my business. I highly recommend Voxer. And I also call it an adult walkie-talkie. And it's also like, I also refer to it as like my bat line to like my VIPs in my group.
Yes.
Right? Meaning VIPs, like my friends, my go-to. It's one Voxer away. They can get to it when they have time, but I can process stuff through Voxer, because I'm also a verbal processor,
Mm-hmm.
and just talk it out. And then they get back to me when it's convenient for them. It does work very, very well for that.
I think asynchronous communication, that's kind of a mouthful, but basically, if you're impulsive and you know you're impulsive, one of the ways you can manage your impulsivity that doesn't require drugs or even another person is asynchronous communication. Just because you want to communicate something to someone, some of us are a little emotional, can be like hot-headed or, tearful or whatever. Emotional regulation is one of the key areas that we need to learn how to manage as entrepreneurs with ADHD. So somebody pisses you off, somebody hurts your feelings, whatever. Send yourself a Voxer message. Do not send it to that person. That buys you a little bit of space so you can cool off a little bit and think about, how do I want to show up in this relationship? Usually it's not the first thing that comes to your mind. So you can use Voxer for that too.
I have a friend of mine, Jessica, whom we did a mental health episode on. She shared with me, it's not the first thought that counts, it's the second.
Yes.
It's really brilliant. I use it in so many different scenarios, but it also helps the shame spiral of when the first thought is just your knee jerk, like that might be hardwired thinking. But the thought you choose is the second thought, and that one counts. It's been incredibly helpful for me as well. Alrighty. So I was just curious about podcasting. So you're a podcaster. I want to share your podcast, but my question is podcasting takes a long-term commitment. It takes consistently showing up. It takes hitting deadlines. It takes scheduling guests. All of these things are like high-level executive function activities. So how have you done that? And what are some strategies that, while maybe someone listening is not doing podcasting, they can take and be like, oh my gosh, it's totally possible to do these things because you're making it work for you?
Such a good question. I think a lot of people with ADHD believe that they cannot be consistent at anything. And I would challenge you, because you can absolutely be consistent at something you love. We all are. Okay. So for me, I know that I'm impulsive. I know that I've had many, many, many times in life, and some really regrettable experiences where I just jumped into something. My analogy for it is I would be the girl who was always jumping off the high diving board before she checked to see if there was water in the pool. And then on the way down, you're like, oh shit, but you also do learn to be resilient and kind of a creative problem solver, because you create so many problems that you either become a victim of your own, stuff, or you become really resilient and you're like, well, I didn't really intend that, but hey, look at this. I figured out a way to make it happen, which I think is super charming. And a lot of us get really, really good at. And it's very annoying to other people because they're like, you always land on your feet, but you just create a lot of noise in the process. Also true. So I just think that, you know what? I just completely forgot your question. This is another thing that happens from time to time.
Oh, that's okay. My question was, what are some strategies you use I'll succinctly say it. What are some strategies you use to stay consistent with podcasting when it takes so many executive functions to do that?
Thank you for repeating the question. So for me, I didn't commit to podcasting right away when I first wanted to. I hit the pause button. And remember, we first met at a podcasting conference where I didn't even have a podcast. But I was already listening to your podcast. I recognized you and I approached you there. So later, I did launch a podcast during the early phases of the pandemic. I was locked up in my house. I couldn't go anywhere. And I thought, I have all the equipment. Now's the time. I have spoken about this on other podcasts. I actually procrastinated for 2 years. 2 years on starting the podcast. I had the show art. I had the intro, outro music with the voice actor. I had the equipment. I had everything. I had the hosting, but I procrastinated. And the reason why that was that I did not think I could be consistent. And I had had too many experiences in my life of being a starter and not a finisher. And this one would be public and expensive. So I didn't do it. But in the meantime, I was a guest on other podcasts. So I was guesting on other podcasts for probably about 3 years. And I finally reached a point where I thought, what do I actually need to succeed with podcasting? I need to tap into my drivers of interest and challenge. And then I need to get support in the areas of structure and accountability. So I hired an assistant to help me set up everything on a Trello board. I hired a podcast strategist to help me map out 12 weeks worth of content. And then I, quote unquote, just needed to show up. In the very beginning, I did all solo shows because I still didn't know for sure I could be consistent, and I didn't want to get guests involved and then make a mess of things. My first 25 episodes were 15 minutes long, and they were solo shows. And I did them in Focus Mate sessions.
I know what that is. I don't know that everybody does. Tell us what Focus Mate is.
So I could do 4 podcast recordings, 10 to 12 at the longest, 15 minutes in the span of an hour. Focus Mate is a wonderful app where you have an accountability partner who is probably a total stranger. They could be anywhere in the world, any hour of the day or night. You need to get something done and you're not doing it. You have up to 3 free sessions a week, and I strongly recommend people stick with the 3 sessions and do not get the unlimited, because I think when we have an unlimited option, we don't use it. When it's restricted, when it's limited, then we're like, I only get 3 hours of this a week, so I better make them count. It actually makes you better at critical thinking and decision making. So I use them to record the episodes of the podcast. And then once I started building an audience and I started getting feedback, I felt obligated to continue doing that for the listeners. And then from there, it was a matter of continuing to make it fun for me. If it's not interesting or fun, one or the other, preferably both, I will eventually fall off the wagon. Mm-hmm. So I continued to look for ways to make it interesting or fun or both. And then realized, okay, I'm done talking to myself for 25 episodes. I need to start bringing other people into the mix. And I'm going to start reaching out to people that I'd like to get to know, or I already know, and I'd like to share them with others. And it kind of built momentum over time. When I can batch episodes for my solos, especially, it gives me a little breathing space. But I've learned for me that if I batch too many, I get into the time optimism thing again. So if I've let's say, for example, I batch 8 episodes, that would be 2 months worth of content. I'm not going to take a 2-month break from the podcast, right? Because it will feel less, I don't know. I will not have the habit as firmly, entrenched. So I
think it's habit, but also you're not as connected, right? They just start publishing. And so then you could be losing interest. Yes. I could see that being a trap. So you have found your sweet spot of not putting yourself in urgency, but not getting so far in advance that you're sabotaging the habit and routine.
Well said. And that's exactly right.
Okay. I really am glad I asked that question, because what I heard was, here's the things which has been your theme this whole interview, is here's the things about me that I accept. Here's how I can ask for help, get support, work with it. Here's where I'm exceptional, and what your drivers are. So how do you lean into that and create that? And you did all of that, not just with your business, but for example, this podcast. And thank you, because had you not done that, had you taken a backseat and just listened to what people said you should do or not do because you have ADHD, or your own thoughts about that, you wouldn't be serving the world with your special gift. And thank you. And I that's the message I want everyone to hear, is that it's worth figuring this out if that's part of your journey, exploring it and figuring out how to work with it. And as you beautifully said, you said dancing with the idea, but I think it's also dancing with understanding yourself and your traits through the journey.
It's so true. And I think anyone can reach the point of radical self-acceptance, whether it's with ADHD or any other kind of difference. It will be up to you because no one is going to do that for you. No one. I mean, other people say, oh, you're so hard on yourself. Why don't you just get over it? It is a very personal decision. But I will say, once I fully owned my ADHD, I started speaking about it publicly. I work with a lot of people with ADHD. I've helped a lot of people that I've met in all kinds of different situations. Like, are you aware that you have ADHD? I've helped so many people get identified who never knew. So many people I've interviewed on my podcast had no idea. And then after we stopped recording, I'm like, you might want to look into this because I'm pretty sure you are. Like my husband says, you think everyone has ADHD? And I say, I do not. But the official figures are like 4.7% of adults. And I think it's actually closer to 12. And I can see it very easily in other people. And if they've never been identified, but they've questioned, I can help them. And if they were identified years ago as a kid and they felt tremendous shame about it, I can help them accept themselves. I don't think it's a superpower. I do not think it's the entrepreneur's unfair advantage. I think I happen to be Buddhist. So my thinking is always kind of what the Buddhists call the middle way. It's not one extreme or another. It's not either or, it's both and. It is responsible for many of my strengths. It is also responsible for many of my struggles. It is my commitment to accept it fully and to manage it daily. And that's what I do to the best of my ability. And the best varies from day to day too.
Thank you so much. I would love for you to share with our listeners about your podcast and then also about the work that you do and how they can reach you.
The name of my podcast is The Driven Woman Entrepreneur. You will see my pre-COVID body flexing my bicep. I must admit, I look pretty good on that show cover. And you can go to my website, Diann Wingert Coaching, spelled DIANN, to find out all the rest of the stuff. I also have kind of a one-page thing that brings a lot of cool stuff together called Shiny Objects. And I'll make sure that Amber has that to link to in the show notes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your journey and your experience. And my goal was that it would empower someone that has had that thought and maybe put that to rest and didn't acknowledge it and was ashamed about it or just wondered why they might feel a little bit different with their work. And I think you've nailed it. And thank you so much for having an honest, open conversation so that others can really feel like they can get the support and show up their best.
It was a sincere pleasure.
Well, what did you think of that conversation with Diann? For me, I thoroughly enjoyed bringing this conversation to Productivity Straight Talk because I know that many of you, and maybe you, yes, you listening right now, can completely relate to the stories and examples that Diann shared. And perhaps you have been properly diagnosed with ADHD or ADD. Or maybe you've just had this little voice in your head that thought, I'm different. Maybe I see things different. Maybe I work different. Things that work for other people, quote unquote, works for them, but why is it not working for me? Whether you've been diagnosed or not diagnosed, and you are struggling with time management, productivity, setting up systems and processes, you are in the right place. I do know that many of my clients have and are diagnosed with ADD or ADHD. And I also know that many are not. Whether you have been diagnosed or not, what I want you to focus on is in these stories here, in these examples, are you struggling with the same struggles? Are you having time blindness? Are you incredibly optimistic about what it is you can do in a day and a week, and therefore planning seems like a complete struggle? Are you saying yes to everything without really thinking about what am I saying yes to, and how does that impact my business? How does it impact my my time, my schedule. These are the things that I work on with my clients specifically. In fact, right before I started my business, I had this idea and I thought, what if time management is a skill that can be learned? And the reason I asked myself that question is because I had heard so frequently people saying, oh, that's not me. It's not my personality. I wasn't born with that gene. Insert whatever those beliefs are, but it's really not taking an empowering position that it is a skill set that can be learned. And once I seeked that out and found out for myself that it actually is a skill set that can be learned, I have built an entire business over a decade helping business owners learn this skill set. And this skill set around time management and productivity, managing yourself and managing time, is so important to a few things, not just achieving our goals, not just being able to achieve our goals quicker and faster, but also being able to achieve our goals while building a business that feels joyful and not stressful. So if you could use some additional support this year, or anytime you're listening to this episode, I would love for you to reach out and schedule a discovery call. I would like for you to check out the ways in which you can work with me. Right now, at the time of this recording, there's 2 ways you can work with me. You can work with me privately in my one-on-one peak performance coaching program, or in Leverage Lab, which is my group coaching, training, and accountability program. If you think that you would love to learn these skill sets and focus on this so that it has this rippling effect, not just on your business, but your life, I think we need to talk, and I look forward to that. Now, this is where I end every episode for those of you that have been around for a while. No change, no change. Without taking action, nothing will change for you or your business. Based on my conversation with Diann today, what were some ahas? What are parts of the story that you recognize and tips you can take away and practice immediately? Some of the tips that we shared were very specific and strategic, and some were around mindset. And it doesn't matter which path you go, just take action after today's episode because that's where the real change happens. And if you want support with learning these skill sets to help support you in your business, I am just a phone call away. So you can head on over to amberdelagarza.com/call. Again, that's amberdelagarza.com/call. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, share it with a friend. If you have a friend that you feel has ADHD, ADD, and you're like, oh my gosh, you need to listen to this. Who are you thinking about? Text them the episode. Let them know that this is a great conversation. You were thinking of them and you think it would be of value to them. And I would so appreciate you sharing the word of Productivity Straight Talk. So that's my straight talk for today. Until next time, have a productive week.